So service management. Who here uses ITIL or is aware of ITIL in their organisation? Oh, most people. Excellent. Okay. So service management. Bear in mind, obviously, ITIL isn't the only service management flavour there is, but it's the one that most people use these days or refer to. So one of the things with service management we try to do is, obviously, we're trying to provide IT services which are consistent, reliable and cost effective. So those are some of the sort of characteristics we look at. So if we look at service management using the same definition we use for risk management, the art of service management is to identify risks, to service and to provide mitigation to reduce them to an acceptable level. So what we're going to look at in this presentation here are three aspects we're briefly going to cover. Obviously service cost, service capacity and service performance. Now you can understand obviously we're capacity and performance people, so that's what we would focus on. It's a lovely diagram that is that defines ITIL version 3, and it's divided up into service strategy, service design, service transition, service operation. Under ITIL 3, service capacity management comes in here. So we're in the design phase now, which is useful. But from a point of view of looking at this from a cloud perspective, we need to look at using this almost as a way to limit that risk. And there's a very useful diagram in ITIL version 3 about using service management as a risk filter. So they have this lovely model, systems model in ITIL version 3, which relates what the business is doing and how service operations support that business. So if you imagine this belt going round, you have demand side risks from the business, so that's things such as we're going to go out and buy another competitor, and that's going to be 30% uplift in our demand of our services. So that's a demand side risk. And obviously service management can act as a filter there and say, well, you can do that, but we won't be able to service more than 15% of that demand. You know, so that's a risk acceptable to a supplier. So that can be an internal organisation, that can be an external IT organisation, and so on. And the same on the supply side as well. We as capacity management have an ability to filter that, and in service management have an ability to filter that to some extent. So obviously, managing service capacity, I don't need to talk too much to an audience such as yourself about summaries, but obviously if you don't do forward capacity planning in your organisation, and a lot of people are using cloud as a reason to, or using these as a reason to move towards cloud, in that they don't necessarily understand the risks themselves in their own enterprise, so they think it would be easier to hand that off to somebody else and get them to worry about it. If we have an outsourcer doing it for us, we don't need to worry about it. So I don't know what they're going to do for backups, I don't know what they're doing for data security, I don't know what data protection is, but hey, that's their problem now, that's not mine. All I need to care about is the code going to work when I upload it onto their system? And what you're actually doing there is you're believing you're outsourcing the risk, whereas you're not. You still own the risk. You still own the risk. The outsourcer is just taking the money for running the service. Yeah. So all these typical aspects, inability to accurately forecast when additional capacity is required, all these things people think go away with cloud computing. And some of them do and some of them don't. So here's a useful diagram from a very useful book, Service Management. Service Management, Operations Strategy and Information Technology, which is not about IT service management. This book was written 12 years ago, and that was the second edition. It's about any form of service capacity. Somebody serving on a till in Sainsbury's, or a professional consultancy such as us, meeting our capacity requirements. So you have service capacity, and in capacity you have demand and supply. Yeah? So these are techniques for managing demand, these are techniques for managing supply. And if you think about cloud computing, where do clouds sit? Partitioning demand. When you have a cloud service, that demand is partitioned onto separate servers within that cloud enterprise. You don't see that, but the cloud provider does. Sharing capacity, that's one of the benefits of having a cloud service, in that you're actually getting the cost advantage of using a small part of a very large enterprise, and creating adjustable capacity. People believe that obviously cloud can do that for them, and it can, again, to some extent. So the relationship between demand, supply and cost, which we've just mentioned, obviously in a traditional organisation you have some marketing and sales department will give you some demand forecasts. Poor souls in capacity planning will then look at those and try and make sense of them and eventually create some form of capacity plan which goes to finance, and then finance says yes or no, we'll pay the money for that, and that creates your budget, and this is a cycle. Skip that one, we haven't got time, you don't need to know that. So if you're looking at the cost model, pricing for cloud services tend to be based on utility models, and you've probably all heard about utility computing. So it tends to be based on a mixture of the following methods. So some form of subscription, usually a monthly fee, a resource usage fee, so for instance CPU seconds, gigabyte storage, I/O, and a transaction fee as well, a number of transactions processed. So all cloud services have one or more of these aspects in their billing. So this is exactly the same as utilities, and that's where the term utility computing came from. This is your gas and your electricity. You pay a monthly subscription and you also pay a usage fee for the amount of units you purchase. So as an example pricing, now there are lots of pricing models out there, most of them are public, but most of them you have to click the little terms and conditions agreement in that you won't talk about that pricing. So therefore, I'm not talking about anybody's pricing in particular here, but here's one that I've abstracted. I've taken and I've abstracted slightly.
It looks pretty much like Amazon's.
Well, I'm glad it does, because it isn't, so that's good. So processing. 10 pence per CPU available per hour. Storage, 12 pence per gigabyte stored per month. Storage transaction, so that's each storage transaction you make, is 1 pence per 5,000 transactions, and data transfers 5 pence in and 10 pence out per gigabyte. So as an example here, again, this is a completely made up case study, but if we were to look at processing, on the processing side, 4.8 cores, so say you needed 4.8 cores of CPU, this is in a day, for instance. 2,000 gigabytes of storage on average, 12,000 storage transactions per hour on average, 150 meg in, 150 meg out. And you plug those figures in, this is what you get per month. So to run that, which is reasonable enterprise, £6,500 per month. Now, you may think, that's not too bad. So pricing on the previous slide compares favourably to buying server hardware. Obviously if you went out and bought hardware, that is more expensive. The issue is, obviously you have to buy, when you buy hardware, you have to buy the hardware, you have to buy software to go on that, the licensing software. Obviously if you're buying some enterprise products, you tend to pay on the amount of CPUs that it uses and so on. And obviously you need also to pay a recurring data centre fee or hosting fee in some data centre. So from that perspective, you've got one massive CapEx cost there, and let's not go into the tax advantages of OpEx versus CapEx, because that does actually affect the calculation in a lot of people's minds. So if you move to a cloud model, it's all operational expenditure rather than CapEx. So therefore, it's a monthly recurring fee. So this is like a lease, and so therefore it is more tax efficient. But let's not worry about that. There's tons of papers out there discussing these various costings. So one thing though, the hosted solution has one advantage. The cost is predictable every month. The cost of cloud is variable. Your demand will change across a month, and so therefore the price will be different every single month. So for instance, say some of these figures doubled, you suddenly saw an upturn in processing, the amount of storage transactions and data I/O all doubled. It ends up in virtually a doubling of costs as well. So that, you may think, well, that's fine, that's easy, that's understandable. That's great for a private sector organisation. If you're in the public sector, the fact that your IT costs may be double what they were last month, and then maybe 50% less the next month, completely screws up their budgets. They budget for this on an annual basis going out 3 or 5 years. So while there are many advantages to adopting a cloud model, there's a risk of uncapped pricing scheme resulting in unexpectedly large bills. IT organisations like budgets, and especially public sector. So this causes a problem. There may be advantages to it, but this does cause a problem. So now to add another factor into a mix, outsourcing. If you have an outsourcer, just imagine what problems they have if they're outsourcing and suddenly they've got an agreement with a customer that for a fixed amount of fixed cost every month, and suddenly the customer puts twice as many transactions down the line. They're having to pay the cloud provider the extra money. So if you look at this was the cap before. Suddenly there's a massive uplift in service and the service cap is breached. The outsourcer is having to cover all these costs unexpectedly. At this point here would be rapidly trying to renegotiate the contract. Yeah. So there's a risk to outsourcers in using that model. How are we for time?
Yeah, pretty much coming up to 7 now.
Oh, I've only got 4 slides left.
That's all right, you probably squeeze it in.
So just to finish off on performance, we've talked about cost briefly, we've talked about capacity briefly, and just on performance. One of the issues obviously with cloud is you still need a service level agreement. Now, I've looked at several of the public service level agreements and they aren't particularly helpful. And they don't go into too much detail. So obviously a private cloud agreement, if you're a large entity and you're going to one of the outsourcers, ASOS or Atos Origin or CSC or whoever, these guys will negotiate a individual contract with you. But if you look at the public cloud providers, they are very generic. So obviously you're all aware of ITIL, so I won't go into talking about service level agreements too much, but one key aspect of a service level agreement is monitoring, measurement and reporting of aspects of service performance. And from our point of view as capacity and performance people, we're interested in things like transactional response times, availability, batch run times, and the end times that batches finish as well. So these can be more difficult to get from an outsourcer. So for instance, if you're using, do your own computing in-house, somewhere you have some data center, you've got some measurable response time out of your local office, you've got some measurable remote response time here, and if you've got good monitoring, you can measure times between web servers and application servers and database servers and so on. However, the moment you move to a cloud provider, there's this demarcation here, and they won't necessarily give you information going past this point. Certainly the public cloud providers won't under their generic contracts. Private cloud providers, you need to negotiate on that. So this you can derive, but you can't, the issue is, of course, you can't figure out necessarily what's going on inside the cloud itself. So that can be an issue. Again, a lot of people say, well, you don't need to worry about that, but as capacity and performance people, we know you do. So as I've been told to stop, and there were people outside beckoning me out, I'll just skip to the summary. So cloud is the new computing paradigm that's here to stay. As with any new technology or business model, it has its pros and cons. Before adopting cloud, it requires careful consideration of service management aspects such as capacity, performance and resilience. The security and data compliance, which I haven't touched on here, it's 10, 15 years since I've been involved in IT security. And obviously the financial model. These are important aspects. Don't just rush headlong like lemmings into the cloud, as it were. There's lots of things to consider. There's lots of good reasons to use the cloud, but you need to be careful and considered about it.
Thank you very much, Andy. Questions to Andy later outside or to any of the people on his stand. But thank you very much, Andy.